In December 1941, a nearly intact Grumman F4F Wildcat was captured on Wake Island. What the Japanese discovered about this American fighter changed their entire approach to combat. Here's why the Wildcat struck fear into their ranks. The F4F Wildcat wasn't just any ordinary plane. It was part of the United States' effort to dominate the skies over the Pacific. Built by the Grumman Company, the Wildcat was designed for naval combat. It was a single-engine, carrier-based fighter that became a workhorse for the U.S. Navy. By the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Wildcat was already a key component of the Navy's air power. When the Japanese came across a captured Wildcat in 1941, it was more than just a trophy. It was a piece of valuable intelligence that provided them with crucial information about American military technology. The Japanese engineers wasted no time in examining the plane and figuring out how it worked. When the Wildcat was tested by the Japanese, they quickly realized it wasn't the fastest fighter, nor did it have the same agility as the Mitsubishi A6M0, the Japanese favorite. The Wildcat, however, had something that made it far more dangerous: survivability. Unlike the Zero, which was light and fast, the Wildcat was a sturdier, heavier machine. It was slower, with a maximum speed of about 331 miles per hour, slower than the Japanese A6M0, but it could climb higher and dive much faster. That meant when combat got rough, the Wildcat could escape with more ease. But what really set the Wildcat apart was its durability. One of the major advantages that the Wildcat had over the Zero was its ability to survive. The Japanese pilots learned this lesson the hard way when they came face to face with the American fighter in battle. Unlike the A6M, the Wildcat was built to absorb damage and keep flying. It had a robust airframe, self-sealing fuel tanks, and even armor around the cockpit to protect the pilot. In contrast, the Zero was fast but fragile. One hit and it could be downed. The Wildcat, however, had the ability to stay in the fight longer, even when badly damaged. This difference in survivability made the Wildcat a terrifying opponent for Japanese pilots, who were used to their nimble but fragile Zeros. The Wildcat was also equipped with powerful weapons that made it a formidable adversary. It had 6.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns that could tear into enemy aircraft. These guns were not only more powerful than the 7.7mm machine guns used by the Japanese, but they were also more reliable. Japanese tests showed that the Wildcat's armament had greater kinetic damage, better penetration, and a longer rate of fire before overheating. While the Zero's 20mm cannons were deadly, the Wildcat's guns allowed American pilots to sustain fire for much longer, increasing their chances of hitting the enemy. The insights gathered from the captured Wildcat had a deep effect on Japanese air combat tactics. By 1943, Japanese pilots were trained to avoid prolonged horizontal dogfights with American fighters. Instead, they were taught to focus on boom and zoom tactics, using their superior climb rates and agility to quickly attack and retreat. This shift in tactics was based directly on the lessons learned from the Wildcat's performance in combat. Instead of trying to engage in close-quarters dogfights where the Zero excelled, Japanese pilots began to exploit their fighters' strengths in high-speed, high-altitude combat. The captured Wildcat gave the Japanese military a rare opportunity to closely examine a frontline American fighter. At a time when most of their information came from reconnaissance and intelligence reports, having a working example of the enemy's fighter plane was a goldmine. The analysis and testing of the Wildcat in Japan was a turning point in the Pacific War. It was one of the few instances where the Japanese were able to understand and adapt to American technology on such a deep level. But this also made the US military realize that they needed to be extra cautious about how they deployed their planes. The Wildcat's capture and study by the enemy only heightened the stakes for the next battles in the Pacific. Fascinated by the Wildcat's impact? Hit like and subscribe for more hidden stories from World War II. You won't want to miss what's coming next. The F4F Wildcat's legacy goes far beyond its performance in battle. While it may have been slower and less maneuverable than the Zero, it was a critical part of the US Navy's success in the Pacific. Its durability and firepower were unmatched, and it gave American pilots a fighting chance against the superior Zero. The Wildcat's capture and subsequent testing by the Japanese highlighted just how important it was to understand the enemy's technology. Had the Japanese gained too much insight, the tide of the war could have turned in their favor. Instead, the Wildcat's ability to survive, Its powerful armament and its overall toughness helped the U.S. maintain air superiority. By the time the U.S. Navy began to rely on more advanced fighters like the F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair, the Wildcat had already made its mark. Even though it was eventually outclassed by newer aircraft, the Wildcat's performance in the early years of the Pacific War cannot be overlooked. It was a crucial part of the Navy's ability to hold off the Japanese onslaught and maintain air superiority in some of the most grueling battles of World War II. In fact, the Wildcat was one of the primary reasons the United States was able to turn the tide of the war in the Pacific. Its design, which prioritized survivability over speed and agility, allowed American pilots to endure longer and fight harder in the face of overwhelming odds. For every Wildcat that went down, another would rise to take its place, and that was exactly what the Navy needed. One of the key reasons the Wildcat terrified the Japanese wasn't just its design, but its role in the broader American strategy. The Pacific theater was vast, with battles occurring over vast stretches of ocean. The Wildcat was the first line of defense for U.S. Navy aircraft carriers, which were vital to the American war effort. As the primary offensive weapon on these carriers, the Wildcat was involved in many critical battles, including the Battle of Midway and the Battle of the Coral Sea. In these battles, the Wildcat's ruggedness became even more evident. While the Zero might have been faster, the Wildcat's ability to survive heavy fire and still carry out its mission made it an invaluable asset. The Japanese soon realized that in these prolonged encounters, the Zero's agility alone couldn't guarantee victory. The American fighters, while not as nimble, were able to endure and keep fighting, which frustrated the Japanese air forces and limited their offensive capabilities. The F-4F Wildcat was crucial in shaping the overall strategy of the U.S. Navy during the war. Even though the aircraft was far from perfect, it allowed American forces to establish a foothold in the Pacific, which was key to turning the tide of the war. The Wildcat's design focused on one thing: staying in the fight long enough to take down the enemy. And that's exactly what it did. As Japanese pilots continued to face the Wildcat in battle, they began to realize that their favorite fighter, the Zero, had a major disadvantage in certain situations. The Wildcat could take hits that would cripple or destroy a Zero. The U.S. Navy's ability to keep pushing back, regardless of how many Wildcats were lost, was something that Japan struggled to adapt to. This shift in the tide of battle led the Japanese to reconsider their approach. In fact, the Japanese military began to shift its tactics after realizing that the Zero's agility couldn't win every battle. They started to rely more on speed and quick hit-and-run tactics, avoiding prolonged dogfights with American planes. But it was already too late. The Wildcat had already delivered its message loud and clear. Toughness and survivability were just as important as speed and maneuverability. The Wildcat's legacy goes beyond its combat record. It served as the foundation for future naval aircraft, particularly the Hellcat, which would go on to become one of the most successful fighters of the war. The design principles of the Wildcat, ruggedness, durability, and the ability to take punishment, were passed down to its successors, who improved on them to create even more powerful and effective aircraft. Despite its shortcomings, the F-4F Wildcat held its own against the best of the Japanese forces, and its influence can still be seen in the naval aircraft of today. The lessons learned from the Wildcat were vital to the success of the U.S. Navy during World War II and beyond. The F-4F Wildcat was a symbol of the U.S. Navy's resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. It wasn't the fastest or the most maneuverable plane in the skies, but it was the one that stood tall when it mattered most. It wasn't the plane that the Japanese expected to fear, but it became the one they couldn't ignore. While the Zero was the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, it was the Wildcat that showed them that there was more to aerial combat than just speed and agility. The Wildcat's ability to endure and fight back, even when severely damaged, made it a fearsome opponent that the Japanese could never quite defeat. And that's why the F-4F Wildcat terrified the Japanese.